Montana Territory, July 1883. The sun was too bright for a day like this. Pearl Sutton stood in the dry dirt outside the white-clapboard church of Willow Creek, her hands trembling around a bouquet of wildflowers someone had shoved into her arms. Her heart thudded so loud she barely heard the whispers, but she saw the looks. Pity in some, judgment in others, and worst of all, satisfaction in the older women who never liked the idea of a mail-order bride. He was gone. Raymond Ellis, the man who wrote her letters for nearly 9 months, who promised her a home, a life, a family, he had not shown up. The preacher kept checking his pocket watch. Mrs. Laird, the pastor's wife, tried to offer comfort, but Pearl barely heard her words. Her corset felt like a vice, her boots too tight, and the neckline of her borrowed wedding dress suddenly felt wrong. She had left everything behind in Ohio. Her father's grave, her mother's silence, her sister's tears. She sold her locket for the train fare and rode west with every bit of hope stitched into her spine. And now she stood here, 22 years old, alone, humiliated, and abandoned at the altar. The church pews emptied slowly. Some looked at her like she was a ghost. Others just tried not to look at all. "I suppose he changed his mind," came an older voice behind her. Pearl turned. It was the town seamstress, Mrs. Kettle, whispering too loudly to a friend. "Men like him never mean what they say." Poor girl was a fool to believe in a dream. Pearl's throat burned. She turned away, but her legs felt heavy. She did not know where to go. She had no money left, no home to return to, and she was too proud to cry not yet. And then a voice, low and rough, broke through the hush. "I will marry her." Every head turned. Pearl blinked against the sun. A man stepped forward from the back, hat in hand, dust on his boots, and a calm steadiness in his voice that somehow cut through her panic. "I will stand up for her if she still wants a husband." He was tall, lean, with sun-brown skin and eyes like the edge of a storm. His hair was dark and a little too long, and his shirt looked like it belonged to someone who worked sunup to sundown. Pearl stared. "You what?" The man stepped closer, not smiling, not performing, just honest. "Name's Weston Price. I have a small ranch east of town. I live alone. I could use a wife. And I figure no woman should be left standing like that." Pearl's lips parted, but nothing came out. Her heart raced. The preacher looked from her to Weston, brows raised. "Miss Sutton?" Everything in Pearl screamed to run. But where? To what? She had nowhere left to go. And something in Weston's eyes, quiet, sure, not pitying, made her take a breath she had not realized she was holding. She nodded. The preacher wasted no time. "Do you, Weston Price, take Pearl Sutton to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Weston's voice was steady. "I do. Do you, Pearl Sutton, take Weston Price to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Pearl's voice shook, but it came out. "I do." Before she knew it, it was done. The crowd had mostly cleared. The preacher offered a blessing and left them standing in the doorway of the church. Married, strangers, both stunned. Pearl turned to him. "Why did you do it?" Weston looked at her for a long moment. "Because no one should be left standing like that. And because I reckon I saw honesty in your eyes." Pearl swallowed hard. "You do not know anything about me." "Then let us start with your name," he said. "Pearl, right?" She nodded. "I am Weston," he said again. "Let me take you home." They walked to his horse in silence. He helped her up with a steady hand, then climbed up behind her. She smelled cedar and leather and dust. His arms did not touch her, but she felt the warmth of him near. The ride eastward was quiet. The land rolled in soft hills, golden grass waving in the wind. His ranch came into view, a modest house, weathered barn, a small corral with 2 horses. It was not much, but it was real. Weston dismounted and helped her down. "It is not grand. It is honest," Pearl said softly, and he glanced at her. Inside the house, it smelled like pine and coffee. A single room, clean but worn. A bed in one corner. A table and 2 chairs. A stove. She stood in the doorway, frozen. "I will sleep in the barn tonight," Weston said, setting down her trunk. "You take the bed." Pearl turned. You do not have to. I do, he said simply. You did not come here for me. I will not ask anything of you you are not ready to give. Pearl looked at him, really looked. He was not handsome in the polished way Raymond had been, but his eyes held something she had not seen in a long time. Respect. Stillness. Maybe even kindness. She nodded. Thank you. He turned to leave, then paused. If you want to head back east, I will help pay your fare. You do not owe me anything. I do not want to go back, she said. He met her eyes. Then we will figure this out. That night, Pearl lay in a bed that smelled of sun-warmed cotton, listening to crickets outside and the distant sound of Weston's horse shuffling in the barn. Her heart was still bruised, but a strange calm settled in her chest. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She stepped outside to find Weston fixing a fence, shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow. He looked up and gave her a small nod. Pearl raised her chin. I can cook. He smiled just a little. I can eat. The days passed. Pearl scrubbed the floors, mended torn curtains, and learned to gather eggs from the hens out back. Weston never pressed her, never hovered. He worked long hours, but always came in for supper, always asked how her day was. He brought her a small bunch of daisies one afternoon, awkwardly handing them over without a word. She took them with a quiet thank you, something soft warming in her chest. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Pearl turned to him. You really meant it that day? He glanced at her. Every word. She looked down at her hands. No one ever stood up for me before. Weston leaned back in his chair, watching the sky fade to orange. Well, maybe it is time someone did. Their eyes met. And for the first time in weeks, Pearl smiled. The first rain came 3 weeks after the wedding, soft and steady, tapping against the windows like it meant to be let in. Pearl stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled, apron tied, stirring a pot of beans she had seasoned with wild sage Weston brought in from the ridge. It was the first evening he hadn't made it back before dusk. She kept glancing toward the door, listening for hoofbeats. When they finally came, she stepped out just as he swung down from his horse, his shirt soaked through and his hat dark with water. He led the gelding to the lean-to, his movements slow and deliberate. I thought you'd be back before the storm, she said, not quite accusing. He shrugged off the rein. One of the calves strayed. Took me near 2 hours to find her. Pearl reached for the horse's tack without asking. She all right? Shaken, but sound. They worked in silence, the rain trailing off into mist around them. Pearl's hands moved steady and sure, unbuckling the straps while Weston peeled off his slick duster. You didn't need to wait out here, he said quietly. I wasn't waiting, she answered, running a hand down the gelding's flank. I was checking the sky. He didn't answer, but his eyes lingered on her face longer than usual before they walked back toward the house. Inside, the lamplight burned low, casting a golden hush over the room. Weston settled at the table, fatigue in the slope of his shoulders. Pearl ladled the beans into 2 tin bowls and poured the last of the buttermilk from the crock. As they ate, Weston spoke without lifting his head. Had a letter waiting for me at the mercantile. Pearl paused, her spoon half raised. From who? He gave a slight shrug. My sister, June. Lives outside Helena. Married a miner. She heard about the wedding from someone who came through town. Pearl set her spoon down gently. She disapprove? She asked if I'd finally lost my mind. A silence fell between them, not heavy, but curious. She's the only kin I got left, he added after a while. My ma died young. Pa passed after a logging accident. It's just June and me now. Pearl watched the flicker of the lamp against his jaw. You close. Used to be, he said. Then life started pulling us in opposite directions. Pearl folded her hands around her cup. I had a sister too, Clara. She's younger. Used to braid dandelions into my hair when we were little. Weston looked up, waiting. She wanted me to stay in Ohio. Said I'd find someone closer to home. But I think she knew I needed to leave. Pearl paused. I didn't fit there anymore. He nodded once, slow. Some places let you grow. Others just keep you stuck. The wind shifted outside, and the oil lamp flickered. Pearl rose to trim the wick, her shadow moving across the wall. He watched her, his voice low. You miss her. Every day, she said. But I don't regret coming here. When she turned back, he was still watching her. Something careful in his gaze. Not searching, not testing, just seeing. I've been thinking, he said. There's an empty patch north of the barn. If you'd like a garden next spring, I'll plow it for you. Pearl blinked, caught off guard. I'd like that. He nodded once, then stood to rinse his bowl. She followed him with her eyes. Why did you really do it? He paused at the basin. Do what? Marry me. I know what you said in town, but I want to know the truth. Weston dried his hands on a rag, not looking at her right away. I'd read about mail-order brides. Knew sometimes men didn't show. I told myself I'd never do that to a woman. Then I saw you standing there, and it didn't feel like something I could walk away from. She stepped closer, her voice quiet. But you didn't know me. No, he said. But I knew what I saw. A woman standing alone, proud as anything, like she'd rather burn than cry in front of them. That told me enough. Pearl looked down at her hands. I didn't expect anyone to speak. You looked like you'd been holding your breath for miles. A stillness settled between them. Then Pearl said, You're a good man, Weston. He met her eyes. I try to be. She hesitated, then reached for the tin cups. I made coffee earlier. It's gone cold, but I can warm it. He gave a small nod. That'd be fine. She turned toward the stove and he sat back down, the chair creaking beneath his weight. The room felt different now, less like two people sharing space and more like something beginning to root, slow and unseen. Pearl stirred the coffee over the flame, her back to him. Behind her, Weston said, You've been writing in the evenings. She glanced over her shoulder. I keep a journal. Always have. You write about here? I write about days, she said, pouring into a mug. What I notice. What I learn. He took the cup from her hands, their fingers brushing. I hope there's something worth writing, even if it's small. Pearl looked at him, her voice soft. There is. They sat together in the quiet, the only sound the wind pressing gently against the walls, and the slow, steady rhythm of two hearts learning to listen. The first frost came early. It settled on the prairie like a hush, silvering the grass and threading along the fence posts like lace. Pearl wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped outside, the morning air crisp enough to catch in her lungs. Weston was already at the shed, oiling the hinges on the door that had started to groan in the cold. She crossed the yard slowly, her boots crunching over frozen earth. You'll wear through those gloves, she said, nodding toward his bare hands. He didn't pause his work. They stiffen up when the weather turns. Can't hold a wrench proper with stiff fingers. Pearl reached into her apron pocket and handed him her second pair. He hesitated, then took them. You sew these? I did. He pulled them on. They fit. I measured your hands when you were asleep, she said, not quite smiling. He glanced up at her, and something warm passed between them, brief but steady. Later that morning, they rode out together to check the southern fence line. Pearl's hands, once soft from city life, now held the reins with quiet confidence. The prairie stretched wide and pale under the hard sky, and the horses moved at a gentle pace. You ever ride before you came west? Weston asked, his voice low over the sound of hooves. Pearl's breath clouded as she answered. Only once. A boy I'd met at church offered to teach me. He got as far as helping me into the saddle before I caught him looking down my dress. Weston's brow twitched, but he gave a short nod, saying nothing. I climbed off and walked the horse back, she added. He didn't offer again. You did right. Pearl glanced at him. You ever court anyone? Not past 2 Sundays, he said. Seemed like the more I said, the less I was understood. Pearl tilted her head. You're not hard to understand, Weston. You just don't waste words. He didn't answer right away. Then you don't either. That's rare. The fence held firm through the frost. They rode back in time for noon meal, and Pearl made cornbread with the last of the cornmeal, slicing it warm and setting the pan between them. Weston poured molasses over his slice without asking, and Pearl watched the way the steam curled in the air between them. "Was your father like you?" she asked, passing him the butter. Weston looked at the table, thoughtful. "He was louder, quicker to drink. But he worked hard and he never hit us. That's more than some can say." Pearl nodded slowly. "Mine never raised a hand either. But he carried silence like a second coat. After Mama died, it got heavier. Clara and I learned to keep quiet around it." Weston didn't look up, but his voice softened. "That kind of silence can wear a person down." Pearl reached for her cup of chicory. "Sometimes I wonder if it wore him through." After the meal, Weston chopped wood while Pearl scraped the last of the autumn apples into a pie crust. The wind picked up, and she tucked a folded towel along the windowsill to keep the draft out. By evening, the pie was cooling on the windowsill and Weston's hands were stained with pitch. Pearl brought out a basin of warm water and set it on the porch without a word. He joined her after a moment, dipping his hands in with a quiet sigh. "I'd like to see Helena one day," Pearl said, watching the stars emerge overhead. "I've never been in a city that far west." Weston wiped his hands dry. "We could ride in come spring. June said she'd put us up." Pearl turned toward him. "Would she want to meet me?" "She's curious," he said, "and she's not one to judge before shaking a hand." Pearl folded her arms. "I'd like to meet someone who knew you before this." "I wasn't different," he said, "just less settled." She watched his profile in the fading light. "You seem settled now." He looked at her steady. "You're part of that." Pearl didn't speak, but her breath caught in a way she hoped he didn't notice. She stood, brushing her skirt smooth. "You'll want a slice of that pie before you turn in," she said. "I will." Inside, the lamp flickered low again, and the house felt close but not confining. Pearl set 2 plates on the table and cut generous slices. She sat across from him, the silence between them no longer uncertain, but lived in. "Do you miss anything from before?" she asked, her fork moving slowly. He considered. "I miss the sound of water. There was a creek near where I grew up. Used to lie beside it at night." Pearl nodded. "I miss lilacs. Mama planted them outside our window. They only bloomed a short while, but when they did, the whole house smelled like spring." "I could plant some," he said, "near the shed. Soil's good there." She blinked, then nodded. "That would be nice." They ate the rest of the pie in quiet, and when they rose from the table, he took both plates without being asked. As he rinsed them, she watched the set of his shoulders, the rhythm of his work, and the way he paused before drying his hands. She stepped closer. "Weston." He turned. "I still don't know what we're building," she said, voice low, "but I don't feel lost anymore." His hand hovered near hers for a moment, then settled lightly on the edge of the table. "Neither do I." And in that stillness, with the wind just beginning to rise again and the warmth of pie still on their tongues, something passed between them unspoken, but understood. Not a promise, not yet, but the beginning of one. The snow came quiet, like it didn't want to be noticed. Pearl stood at the barn door, watching it drift down in long, slanting lines. The sky had turned to pewter sometime after noon, and now the ground was taking on a pale hush, softening the hard lines of fence posts and wagon ruts. Weston was inside, sharpening the draw knife by the stove, the steady scrape of steel on stone keeping time with the ticking mantel clock. She'd spent the morning mending the seams of his winter coat, but her fingers kept drifting to the window. The silence outside wasn't empty, it felt like the land was waiting for something. She turned before the cold could settle into her bones. He didn't look up when she stepped inside. "That's no stay and put this time." "I figured," she said, unpinning her shawl. "The chickens wouldn't come out of the coop. They always know before I do." Weston set the blade aside and leaned back in his chair, stretching one leg out. "You think we have enough put by?" She nodded. "I counted the jars. We'll be careful, but we won't go hungry." He crossed his arms. "You work hard, Pearl." So do you. He looked at her then, and whatever he saw in her face made his shoulders ease. She poured 2 mugs from the pot on the stove and brought one to him. I found a small cedar box in the cabinet this morning, she said, settling into the chair across from him. He took the mug. That was my mother's. She kept dried herbs in it. Used to make a poultice for just about everything. There were 2 dried apple cores in the corner. He gave a quiet huff. She used to say they kept the house sweet through winter. Pearl traced the rim of her cup. She sounds like someone I'd have liked. She was kind, he said. Didn't say much, but her hands stayed busy. She'd sit with her quilting hoop for hours, just stitching and humming. Pearl's eyes flicked to the folded quilt at the end of the bed. She make that one? Weston nodded. The last before she passed. They sat without speaking for a while. The wind pressed against the walls in slow, hollow bursts, and the scent of pine smoke drifted through the cracks in the stove door. I saw Thomas Coyle at the Mercantile last week, Weston said after a moment. He asked if we'd come to the winter social next month. Pearl raised her eyebrows. You said yes. I said I'd ask you. She hesitated. I've never danced in a place like that. Not since I was a girl. You wouldn't have to, he said. But they'll serve stew and let the fire burn high. Might be nice to see faces for a change. Pearl looked at her hands. I don't know if folks there want me. He set his mug down. I do. She met his gaze. I wouldn't ask if I didn't, he added. Her voice was quiet. Then I'll come. He nodded once. That evening, she took out a length of calico she'd tucked away in her trunk. She ran her fingers over the fabric, then folded it into her lap. Could make a dress from this, she said without lifting her head. If I'm careful with the pattern. Weston was by the hearth, stacking kindling. You'll look fine in anything. Pearl looked up, startled. He didn't glance back, just kept laying down the wood. When the fire caught, he sat across from her again, and they listened to the whistle of the wind slipping along the eaves. She threaded a needle and started a seam, the lantern light catching the shine of the thread. You've never asked me what I expected, she said after a while. He didn't move. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. She kept sewing. I thought I was coming towards something easy. A man who'd always smile. A house with lace curtains. Letters that turned into love. Weston's voice was low. And now, I think I came towards something better, she said. Even if I didn't know it then. He watched her fingers move through the cloth. I don't need lace, she said. But I like how the house feels with your boots by the door. He rose after a moment and crossed to the table, taking up the cedar box. He opened it, pulled something from inside, and walked back to her. He held out a small square of yellowed cloth. The stitching was faded but careful, a clumsy heart sewn in red thread. First thing I ever tried to make, he said. Mama taught me to sew a patch that winter Pa broke his leg. I was 6. Pearl took it, running her thumb over the uneven lines. You kept it this whole time? He nodded. Didn't know why. Just did. She folded it gently and placed it beside her calico. Then I'll sew it into the lining of my new dress, she said. So I remember what's real. Weston's eyes didn't leave her face. I want to stay, she said quietly. I know, he answered. I'm glad. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the fire burned slow and clean. Pearl kept sewing as Weston sat close by, the hush of the storm folding over the house like a blanket, and between them, something rooted deeper still. The morning of the social dawned clear, the snow packed tight beneath the horses' hooves as Weston hitched the team to the wagon. Pearl stood at the window fastening the last buttons on her new dress, the calico warm against her skin. She'd stitched the hem by lantern light, careful and slow, and had lined the bodice with a square of old cloth that now sat close to her heart. She'd brushed her hair back and pinned it low, letting a few strands fall soft at her temple. When she stepped outside, Weston paused, reins in hand. You look like spring walked into winter, he said, voice quiet. Pearl stepped into the wagon, her gloved fingers brushing his coat as she settled beside him. I hope it's not too much. It's just right. The road into town wound through bare cottonwoods and across the narrow bridge that had iced over in the night. Pearl watched Weston guide the team with steady hands, his joy roughened from a morning shave, his coat collar turned against the chill. She'd only ever seen him in work clothes, but tonight he wore his Sunday shirt, the one with the stitched cuffs she'd mended without telling him. At the schoolhouse, lanterns had been strung along the eaves and music spilled into the night from the crack in the door. The windows glowed warm and laughter drifted out like with smoke. Inside, the benches had been pushed against the walls and a fiddler stood near the stove, tapping his boot in time. Pearl stepped in, eyes adjusting to the light, and saw familiar faces: Mrs. Laird arranging gingerbread on a plate, Thomas Coyle pouring coffee from a tin pot, and a few others nodding politely as she passed. Weston took her coat and hung it on the peg beside his. "You warm enough? I'm used to colder than this," she said, brushing her skirt smooth. They stood near the back wall, watching couples turn slow across the floor. No one asked Pearl to dance, but no one turned their backs either. She caught a few glances, some curious, others cautious, but none unkind. After a while, Weston leaned closer. "Would you walk with me?" She nodded, and they stepped out into the cold again, boots crunching over the packed snow. The stars above hung low and sharp, and the wind had settled. They walked past the edge of town, toward the edge of the frozen creek where the trees kept the worst of the chill at bay. "Thank you," Pearl said, "for bringing me. I wanted you to see it. Not just the town, but how folks live here. It's not always loud like tonight. But there's decency. I can see that now." He stopped near the trees, looking out over the white field beyond. "When I first built the house, I didn't think I'd share it. I figured I'd just keep to myself. Work, sleep, do it again the next day." Pearl's breath curled between them. "What changed?" "You," he said. "You came in quiet, but you filled up every corner. I didn't know how much that place needed light until you brought it." She reached out, her hand sliding into his. "I didn't think anyone would ever see me the way you do," she said softly. "I thought I had to earn a place by being useful, by not asking too much." "You don't have to earn anything with me," he said. "You already belong." She looked up at him, the starlight catching in her eyes. "I want to build a life with you, Weston. Not just survive alongside you, but build it together." He pulled her closer, his hand warm at the small of her back. "Then let's do just that." Their first kiss came there, between the hush of the trees and the sound of the wind brushing low through the grass. It wasn't rushed or unsure. It was the kind of kiss that settled something long unsettled, like a door opening to a room long closed. They walked back to the wagon hand in hand, and as they rode home beneath the stars, Pearl leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, his arms steady around her. By the time they reached the house, the lantern inside had burned low, casting soft amber light against the frost-streaked windows. Weston helped her down without a word, but his hand lingered at her waist before he let go. She turned to him at the doorstep, her voice low. "I think I'd like to stay here tonight." He held her gaze. "You always have a place here." "I know, but tonight, I want more than a place. I want you." He unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting her in ahead of him. The fire had faded, but the warmth still held. Pearl slipped off her gloves, and when he came to stand beside her, she reached up and touched his face, fingers gentle at his jaw. That night, they lay in the quilt his mother had made, the one tucked tight at the corners, and the room no longer felt like borrowed space, felt like home. They woke to sun painting the floorboards gold, the snow outside glittering clean and new. Weston brewed coffee while Pearl peeled apples from the root cellar, and they talked about the garden they'd plant come spring, and the room they might add on if the next winter proved harder. They talked about writing to June and inviting her out for summer, about trading eggs for sugar at the mercantile, about mending the back fence where the rails had loosened. But mostly they talked about each other. He told her how the sound of her humming while she worked had become his favorite part of the day. She told him how she felt steadier with him near, like the ground stayed firmer beneath her feet. They didn't need to say love. It was in the way they moved around each other, the way they shared breath and warmth and silence without needing to fill it. Through the seasons that followed, they built with slow hands and sure hearts. Pearl's garden bloomed with beets and early peas. Weston taught her how to ride bareback when the days grew long, and she taught him how to read her favorite storybook in the evenings. They never left the homestead for long, not because they couldn't, but because everything they needed had taken root there between the lines of a stitched hem, the creak of a porch chair, and the sound of two voices lifting together at the start and end of every day. They grew old with patience, never rushing, never wanting more than what they had, a quiet life, deeply shared. And when the wind came again whispering through the cottonwoods, it carried only peace with it. Because Pearl and Weston had already weathered the hardest winter and found their spring.